Does Jake Gyllenhaal have enough star power to reboot Roadhouse in 2024? Let's find out. Hello everyone, I'm K-Swope, and in 1989, Roadhouse hit theaters starring Patrick Swayze. 35 years later, Roadhouse then hits Amazon Prime Video starring Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, the question is going to be, does this movie stand up compared to the original one? Which I'm not going to answer because I've not seen the original one, so sorry to disappoint. But we are going to ask the question, is this a good movie objectively? If you want to hear me answer that question, stick around to the end of the video to find out. Now, ladies and gentlemen, with my reviews, I always talk about the good, the bad, and then whatever else needs to be mentioned. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in. We always start with the good, so we're going to start with the good of this movie. Few things. First of all, I'm going to note this before I say, because I do have a few points, both in the good and the bad, that have to do with this. But Post Malone is in this movie, which is kind of strange, not going to lie. And he's only in it for like a few minutes at the beginning. And I think it's interesting seeing him, because like, I don't dislike Post Malone. I don't really love him or hate him. I'm just kind of like neutral about him. But Post Malone is in this movie, and from the beginning of the movie, so spoilers ahead, by the way. In the beginning of this movie, they are fighting in some type of like underground fighting rink or whatever, and he's like their champion dude or whatever. And then Jake Gyllenhaal's character walks out, and if you look at the physique between Jake Gyllenhaal and Post Malone, let's just say there's a stark difference. And I think it's funny because they kind of play that up, and they're like, "Oh crap, I'm not fighting this guy," and he just forfeits, and it's kind of funny. So there's a little bit of humor in this movie, not a lot, but just like a little bit sprinkled in here and there. And so that joke specifically, that's like right at the beginning of the movie. I thought that was pretty entertaining. But I was also sort of still kind of caught off guard seeing Post Malone, which was very interesting. We'll have more on Posty in just a bit when we get into the bad section, which I will get into very shortly. Moving on later into the movie as well, good things. I really like Jake Gyllenhaal just kind of as an actor, generally speaking. And so there's a scene in it where he's at the Roadhouse. This is like, I guess, his first night working there or whatever. And, he's a bouncer, of course. And what happens is there are some dudes that are kind of rowdy, trying to cause some chaos. And I feel like he handles them, like, very professionally. Like, almost so well that you can almost make a training video to show bouncers at bars. If you ever go online and watch those really corny training videos from, like, Denny's or whatever about how to prepare food, how to talk to customers, that kind of thing. Like, I don't know. Not that it's corny, because it's not corny in the movie, but I think it's funny, and he handles them, like, very professionally, I think, until he beats them up, of course. Because what kind of movie would it be if, he didn't beat somebody up? But speaking of beating them up, this is my next point. Again, this has to do with the humor. I do think the humor, little bit, it's not like a funny movie by any means, but a little bit of humor they have sprinkled throughout, I just think is kind of enjoyable. Because after he beats up the guys, he takes them to the hospital, and they're all just crammed in a car listening to Kokomo by the Beach Boys. And so that's kind of funny. Another thing in this movie that I liked, because I was able to point it out, I think, but they do have a instance of the Chekhov's gun. Now, if you guys don't know what the Chekhov's gun is, basically, it's if in the first part of your story somewhere, you mention your dad's gun on the wall, that means that by Act 3, that gun has to go off. And so in this case, there's a crocodile that they mention earlier on in the movie. We know it's out there, and then it basically eats somebody, which is very fascinating. But I think it's a nice payoff. We'll just say it's a nice payoff. Now, there's some big things in this movie that are worth talking about. Namely, I want to talk about Conor McGregor, who is a pretty big role in this movie. He is, if I'm not mistaken, some really big UFC fighter. It's interesting seeing him because we've had a lot of athletes in the past, specifically like fighters and wrestlers, who have broken into acting. Conor McGregor's character, I will say, probably my favorite part of this movie, if I'm being completely honest, because he's just like crazy. Every time he comes on screen, I know things are going to get interesting. So I really liked that. And it doesn't really have anything to do with his acting per se, as much as it is with, I think, how well written his character is. He doesn't do a bad job at acting, don't get me wrong. But I definitely think the writing was very well done for this character to make him interesting. Because he's basically like the main thug, if you will, for the main antagonist, which I think is very fascinating. Now, of course, with Conor McGregor in it, there's going to be a lot of fighting in this movie. And the fighting choreography is amazing. And it's amazing because all of the action feels very realistic and almost weighted, if that makes any sense. So, like, the punches, people treat and act like they're actually, like, punched to an extent. I have one complaint about that I'll get to in just a minute. People are beating the crap out of each other, essentially, and you really feel it, like the makeup design for the blood and people looking beat up looks really good as well. There's one instance in the movie, too, that is both, I think, well-written and kind of funny, where they have this big, huge brawl in the bar, and I think it's funny because the band is still playing the whole time. And I was watching it, I was thinking to myself, why the heck is this band still playing? And I actually wrote that down as a bad thing. And then I saw at the end of it, even when everyone's cleared out, because this whole bar's, gone to crap because everyone's been beating the crap out of each other, they're still playing as like a gag they show later, and I'm like, that's actually really funny. That's worth mentioning. The other thing I want to say too, and this has to do with everything I just mentioned, with the choreography, with the fights, the bulk of the good parts in this movie take place in the second half of it. We'll get to the first half when we get into the bad things. But before we get into those, I also want to mention that the last 10 minutes specifically of this movie are the best, if you ask me. If I were to go back and rewatch this movie, everything I'd want to rewatch is probably in that last 10 minutes, which is a little bit of a bad thing. But all the coolest action and fights, they all happen in that last couple of 10 minutes. Plus, during the final fight, there is really good... as I mentioned before, if you watch my other reviews, but I really like when they use music, not like score music, like music with lyrics, if you will, very well in the movie. And they do that with the bar fights, but specifically, I really liked during the final fight, okay, at the last part of it, okay, they start playing... I think it's just like the instrumental, if I'm not mistaken, of Enter Sandman by Metallica. It's not the Metallica version, but I was still hearing it, and I'm like, that sounds like Enter Sandman. And sure enough, it was, because with Amazon Video, Prime Video, they have the X-ray thing, so you can see all of the actors on screen, and if there's a certain song that's playing, you can see it there as well. And I pulled it up, and sure enough, Enter Sandman. And so I quite enjoyed that quite a bit. But with every good thing I have to say, I probably have more issues with this movie than I do good things to say about it. Starting with taking it back to Post Malone. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this movie, they're fighting in some type of like underground fighting ring or whatever. People are like placing bets on, who's going to win the fight and stuff like that. And Post Malone is like this top tier, like the best guy that they have that night. And he's fighting a guy that's like way bigger than him. And Post Malone's like not even in great shape or anything either. So I'm thinking to myself, like, really? Post Malone's beating up all these people? It's kind of weird. I think it was kind of dumb, honestly, until the bit I mentioned before where Jake Gyllenhaal shows up. And he's like, nah, I ain't fighting that guy. And later on after that scene, he goes out and some patron, I guess, is mad at him. Because I guess they're running a scam where he shows up because he's this acclaimed former UFC fighter, Jake Gyllenhaal's character is. And so he shows up and gets the guy to forfeit, making a lot of people lose their money. And so he gets like a cut of that, I guess. And some guy comes out and stabs him, right? And then he like gets scared off. He stabs him. I want to say that he stabs him and then leaves the knife inside like his abs. He's talking because the lady who owns the Roadhouse shows up. She's trying to get a good bouncer because of the plot of the movie and stuff. And so she goes up to him and is talking to him about the job. And I mean, she addresses, are you going to pull that knife out? And he says, well, yeah, but as soon as he does, it's going to start bleeding. And yeah, sure, that's fine. But also, to get into your car to bend over to get your first aid kit out, that knife's just going to keep sliding in and out and make the cut deeper and wider, probably. So that's pretty stupid if you ask me. So there's some stupid points there. I feel like every movie I watch has a little bit of stupid in it, so I almost want to keep like a stupid point meter. That might be a fun thing to do sometime. But yeah, either way, I think that's a dumb plot. Kind of stupid. But that knife wound does play a part in the rest of the movie, specifically with setting up certain characters and things like that, which I'll get into later. This movie has got its moments, but it is not written very well, generally speaking. After the stab wound and everything, he's like, no, I'm not interested in stuff. It's so weird. Again, this is just not written well because he's all like depressed and he's like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to keep doing my thing. And then for some reason, he just drives his crappy beat up car onto a train track to get hit by a train. And then he gets cold feet the last minute and moves so that the train doesn't like completely obliterate him. But I'm thinking to myself, okay, so this guy clearly doesn't have anything to live for. And then the next scene, I guess, is him going to the Florida Keys where this movie mostly takes place. From there, it's like as soon as we see him in the Keys, he's acting completely different. It doesn't make sense to me because I'm thinking to myself, why is he acting the way he's acting in like the first 10 minutes of this movie, and now he's acting like a completely different person, and then he's acting like this completely different person throughout the rest of the movie, which is really confusing, And again, I just don't think it's written well. And it's not that Jake Gyllenhaal does not play either of those roles well. It's either the directing, probably the directing maybe, more than the writing. But still, it doesn't make sense to me. They don't explain why he has a sudden attitude change and why he's just acting so much different and like a much more pleasant dude after that. Something else about this movie too, I gotta point out that I don't like, is they kind of keep poking at the point that this movie is essentially like a Western film in terms of how this lone hero who has done all these fights and things strolls into town to take out some bad guys, and then he eventually leaves and goes on, which he does do in the movie. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But when you point it out so many times in the movie like they did, just at any point you possibly can, saying, oh yeah, this is like a Western, you're like a Western hero, you're like this Clint Eastwood cowboy type dude. It's like, okay, I get it, you're making it not special now, because it would have been interesting, I think, if people could watch the movie and dissect it and think, oh, wait a minute, this movie's actually a Western, and then they explain why, and you're like, oh, that makes sense. But in this movie, no, they don't do that. They're just like, hey, this is a Western movie, guys. Can you believe that? We're using a Western format. We're using a Western format. You got that? Okay? It's like a Deadpool fourth wall break, except they're not actually doing it. Because if they would have actually done that, it would actually be funny and a lot better writing, if you ask me. Not to mention, Jake Gyllenhaal's character has this just like overdone like tough guy trope, which I guess is similar to the Westerns with the whole like Clint Eastwood, lone cowboy type of thing. I almost feel like they keep pointing out that it's a Western to kind of excuse why he's acting this way, but like, I don't know. It just seems overdone, especially the point that they keep pointing out that it's a Western, which I'm not gonna stop talking about how much they point out that it's a Western, because I want to let the people know how annoying it is. So I'm going to keep pointing it out because you guys kept pointing it out. Does that make sense? Hopefully. But, yeah. So his character, I don't really care for all that much. Again, I think Conor McGregor's character is the most interesting person in this movie, quite frankly. And he's just a loose cannon the whole time, which is partially, I think, why I like him. He's so entertaining. And so in the movie, too, there's one specific instance where the CGI is just some of the worst CGI I've ever seen. Like, think really bad Marvel CGI. It's like on the same level as that, where he's walking home and he's on like an overpass, like a bridge kind of, and one of the guys from who's working for the bad guy sees him on the street, tries to hit him with his truck, and the whole sequence is completely CGI when he's trying to hit him, and it's really bad looking. There's no other way to say it. And as a film guy, I am really fed up with just CGI in general. Because I think two things. You either have to make it look really good and spend a lot of time on it to make it look good, or it just looks awful all the time. And so I know people have been talking about Marvel lately with their bad CGI, which I completely agree. I think it's pretty awful. But it's like, I'd rather you not use CGI than use it and it look bad. I'd rather that whole sequence not be put in or just done differently, to be quite frank. And then this part of the movie is a little worse too, because he avoids that. He narrowly survives that attack, and then he gets back to his houseboat, and the guy who tried to hit him is sitting there with a shotgun, and he does this classic bad guy monologue thing where it's like, dude, you're there to do a job, why don't you just like do it, catch him off guard, don't let him know you're standing there with a shotgun, because he didn't notice he was in there until he spoke up, if I'm not mistaken. And so if this bad guy would have just not said anything and just bang, problem solved, movie over. Which is probably why they had him do that dumb monologue anyways, because the movie would be over if it weren't for the guy with the shotgun. Something else that's worth mentioning too is I feel like the whole first act just feels off in terms of the pacing. Like, it feels really rushed. I mentioned how he goes through like a big character switch like 10 minutes in the movie from how we're seeing him throughout most of it. And so the first act is generally, if I were just to say straight up, not good. Smaller thing, this is more of a nitpick, but I don't like seeing naked men's butts. Yeah, there's that. Conor McGregor, there's his cheeks for all to see. We'll put it like that. It's full moon shining. So, I mean, if you're into that, this might be your movie, but I'm not. Something I think is important to mention as well. There is a love story kind of going on between Jake Gyllenhaal's character and this nurse, who, if I'm not mistaken, she's the same actress who played Ratcatcher 2 in The Suicide Squad. The whole thing just feels, I don't want to say dated per se, but like if it was an older movie and they were to have this love story, I'd think, yeah, okay. But realistically, that's not how relationships work, how they're shown in this movie. It's so weird. I don't feel much chemistry between them two, and the whole thing just feels kind of awkward. I feel like, and again, I haven't seen the original Roadhouse, I feel like they're just trying to duplicate or copy something from the original Roadhouse, even though I guess they couldn't think of a way to make it fit and feel natural. And one more thing I want to mention before we get to my conclusion is there is a credit scene at the end of this. Not good or bad. Kind of funny, though, where Conor McGregor's character is storming out of the hospital after he, like, nearly dies in the final fight, which I think we're all assuming he was dead. So I don't know if they're trying to make a sequel, set it up, but we do get to see his raw booty cheeks again. So, at the end of the day, Roadhouse had some pretty great action sequences, but that's all it really has going for it, to be quite frank. The plot and characters are all pretty lame. The setting of the movie is pretty nice in the Florida Keys. I do like seeing that a lot, so there was a lot of good aesthetic there. But none of that stuff is able to save it from being a good movie per se, so I'm going to score this one with a 5 out of 10 because it's not great. There's some things worth seeing in the movie, I think, especially if you like action movies. Outside of those things here and there, I don't see much reason to watch it. Now, again, I haven't seen the first Roadhouse, so I don't know how this compares to that one, or if the first one I would even think to be that good. But I can tell you that watching this one by itself, isolated, not knowing anything it's based off of, it's not very good, to be quite honest. But, ladies and gentlemen, that will wrap up my review of Roadhouse. Now, thank you guys all for joining me. If you enjoyed this review, feel free to like, comment, or if you'd like, subscribe as well. I'm making more reviews like this and a few commentary videos as well. So I like getting in front of the camera and talking to people. So if you have any thoughts, if you agreed, if you disagreed, please feel free to comment. But in the meantime, I am K-Swope. I will see all of you guys in the next review.